Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Talisha Harrison, and I'm a clinical research specialist at Acclinate. And one of the most important aspects of my position is to help our now included community members connect with research opportunities as well as clinical research sites in their areas. And I'm really excited about this conversation we're going to have today. For this webinar, Research in Our Community, we have brought with us some of our community partners, Clinical Trial Research in Sacramento, and the California Black Health Network. We're here today to talk about making sure that the Black community not only feels included, but empowered to participate in clinical research, and that we understand the impact that this participation has on the health of our communities. Much of today's discussion will focus around cardiometabolic health, and we'll learn much more about that as the webinar, as we embark on the webinar itself. And our goal today is to have a candid, community-centered conversation. We want you to leave here feeling heard, seen, and empowered, and making sure that you understand that you have a seat at the table when it comes to the future of medicine. Joining me today, we have some wonderful panelists, and they are going to help educate us and have a wonderful, transparent, open, honest conversation about these topics. And at this time, I'd like to invite them to introduce themselves. Rhonda, would you please introduce yourself?
Thank you, Talisha, for having me as part of the conversation today. I'm Rhonda Smith. I'm the Executive Director of the California Black Health Network. We are a statewide organization that works to advance health equity for all Black Californians.
Thank you, Rhonda. Dr. Wayne.
Everybody, and thank you, Talisha, for having me be a part of this. I'm Dr. Jeffrey Wayne. I'm a physician and have been practicing internal medicine in the Sacramento area for over 30 years. I'm also a principal investigator, having conducted over 300 clinical trials. We have two facilities, one in Sacramento and the other in Lincoln. And basically, we test new medications in multiple therapeutic areas, including diabetes, high blood pressure, and elevated cholesterol. Happy to be here.
Thank you, Dr. Wayne. Alan, could you please join us?
Hi, Talisha. Thank you for having me. So my name is Alan Jazuli. I'm the Business Development Manager at Clinical Trials Research. I've been working alongside Dr. Wayne for the last 7 or 8 years on over 100 trials. And my role includes finding new trials for our offices, ones with the right treatments, also creating informative materials for patients about our new studies, and also working with patients to find studies that are a good fit for them.
Wonderful. And our last panelist, George.
Hi, everyone. My name is George Clayton. I'm a pharmacist by training. I trained at Xavier University of Louisiana out of New Orleans, and I'm happy to be here today. I've been in the pharmaceutical industry over 20 years, and over the last several years, I've been an advocate for inclusive research, and I'm glad to be here today, and thank you, Talisha, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
All right, and I am as well. So let's go ahead and get started. And this first question is for you, George. As an advocate for health equity, could you help us understand what cardiometabolic disease is and why it disproportionately affects the Black community?
Yes, thanks for the question. And what I'd like for the audience to think about is cardiometabolic disease is not just one disease. It's more of a cluster of diseases. And let's break the word down into 2 parts. For the cardio part, you're thinking about something like a heart attack and a stroke. That's for the cardiovascular part. And for the metabolic part, I want the audience to think about a disease such as type 2 diabetes, because that's what's affected there. And so it's not necessarily one disease, but cardiometabolic refers to more of a cluster of diseases that disproportionately impact African Americans. For African Americans, what you'll see is there's a higher rate of hypertension. You're looking at a higher rate of probably heart attacks, and you're also looking at a higher rate of stroke and a higher rate of obesity, which also leads to a higher rate of type 2 diabetes. So for the diseases that are within the cluster of cardiometabolic diseases, African Americans tend to have higher rates. And for the situation specifically that concerns me the most is a higher rate of death due to cardiovascular diseases that you do see among African Americans compared to the, say, the European American population. And so that's my biggest concern. Specific to the state of California, those trends are very consistent. They are compounded by what you would call social determinants of health. So for the African American community in California, that community may have less access to healthy food, less secure housing, a higher rate of stress, which can also contribute to those higher rates and sort of be a leading contributor to that. Now, give California credit, California did expand Medicaid. However, what you still see is less access to preventative care. And so when someone who's African American may present to the healthcare system with the lack of access to preventative care, you could probably see more of a crisis situation. Let's say someone's blood pressure is really high, their blood glucose is really high. They're in a situation where they are, where you really are finding something that somebody's more in a crisis situation because they haven't had access to preventative care. And so just to kind of close it out, it's not just one disease, it's a cluster of diseases. Higher rates in African Americans, compounded by some of the situations in California where social determinants of health may impact, African Americans in a not so positive way.
Thank you, George, for that explanation. Rhonda, can you add to that? What are some of the barriers that prevent the Black community from accessing clinical research and even learning more about these conditions?
Yeah, well, I think I look at this at the individual community as well as system level. From an individual level perspective, and I think our community holds on to the mindset of mistrust, and rightly so. If you look back over our history and think about the syphilis study at Tuskegee or the Henrietta Lacks story, there's a reason to not trust the healthcare system or even healthcare providers. And then at the community level, it's not about not being able to access clinical trials or them being conveniently located in communities where our people live. And then at the system level, I think that the availability of information or the intentionality behind making sure that that information is available for all patients is also a barrier. I think, unfortunately, most often, white providers don't always share information with patients of color who may be facing a end-of-life situation or a stage 4 cancer diagnosis and participating in a clinical trial as an option when all other commercially available options may not work or be the right fit for that patient. In addition to that, just interacting with the healthcare system, oftentimes we're confronted with dealing with racial bias and mistreatment related to that. And then again, it's just access to information and availability of that information very easily for our community and within the system that is providing care itself. And then I guess the last thing I'll talk about is a lot of times when there are clinical trials, there are in locations where there might be academic institutions, but not necessarily in locations that, again, are conveniently located to where people live. So traveling very far or even out of state to participate can be a barrier because of affordability. And unfortunately, this is one of the casualties of what is happening now. There was a nonprofit organization called the Lazarus Foundation that actually did provide financial support for people who had to travel, who were participating in clinical trials. But unfortunately, because of the current circumstances, they are no longer in existence. And so that's unfortunate. And also a lot of people will be impacted by the absence of that resource.
Definitely. Thank you, Rhonda and George, for really setting the stage, helping us understand what cardiometabolic disease is, and really the challenges that our communities face in terms of getting adequate health care and access and representation in clinical research. Dr. Wayne, I want to come to you for a second. I know you introduced yourself as a principal investigator at the CTR, and so you really understand what it means to be the head of this type of site. But I also understand that you have personal experience participating in research. So would you please share with us your experience and how it's helped shape the way you see clinical research?
Well, so my personal story. Let's go back 9 years, 2016. I was at the gym. I was exercising, and after I finished, I had a little bit of chest discomfort, and I had a function to go to where my wife was hosting some elementary schoolers, and told her about the chest pain. She said, "Jeff, we should go to the ER." I said, "No. We're at McDonald's. I'll have some French fries. It's probably my heartburn." And so that was that. A week later, I was back at the gym exercising, and I started having some chest pain. And I kept going. The chest pain became very, very severe. And this gym that I'm at was literally right next to the hospital where I practiced. But instead of going to the hospital, I was in full-blown denial. I had a friend of mine take me home. I could barely even walk out to the car. I get home and I'm pale and sweaty and nauseated and having this severe chest pain. Again, I could barely walk. My wife insisted I go to the emergency room. I showed up. They brought me in. And when you have chest pain and you show up in an ER, whatever race or ethnicity you are, they're generally gonna bring you right in. And I watched the EKG being done on my heart. He tore it off the machine. I asked to look at it, and I saw myself having a heart attack. And at that point in time, all the avoidance, all the denial just went away, and I surrendered to the reality of what was happening, that I was, in a full-blown heart attack. And I tell this to you because maybe it's relatable. Obviously, this is a good example of my ability to be in denial and not to face my health conditions, and perhaps that resonates with you in the audience. And this is not a white doctor speaking to Black African Americans. This is one human being sharing with other human beings, and it was a real wake-up call for me. So at the same time as my heart attack, I was diagnosed with high blood pressure and high cholesterol and prediabetes. And over the last 9 years, I've cleaned my act up. I've improved my diet. I exercise 5-6 days a week, and I take my medications as prescribed. So diagnosis and treatment of these heart risk factors is very personal to me. And it's a significant driver of my interest in researching new medications for these conditions. So something I should discuss is that most people don't really know about clinical trials and their availability. And those that do, there's a lot of skepticism about research, fear of the unknown, fear of side effects. I don't want to be a guinea pig. At Clinical Trials Research, and that's CTR for short, we do try to recognize these concerns, and we address them with you with honesty and transparency. And when patients come into the office to meet with us for a potential study, we talk about the risks and the benefits of the research study, and we point out all of your rights. In California, there's a Bill of Rights. We're the only state in the country that has the Bill of Rights, and it increases your safety in clinical trials. And while you're visiting us, I suggest that you discuss the study with your family and your personal doctor before you commit. In terms of benefits for individuals that participate in research, you get to have access to new treatments, your medical care can be enhanced, and you have an opportunity to contribute to medical advancements. You get to be part of the greater good. And I think for some people, participation in a trial can provide a sense of purpose and involvement in one's own healthcare.
Thank you so much for sharing your experience, Dr. Wayne. That was really helpful, and I'm sure you bring, that expertise of your experience into the clinical trial space, as you mentioned. Why not bring it back to George? We understand that representation in clinical trials isn't just about fairness; it's about our health. Can you break down why not having diversity in research can make treatments less effective for people in the Black community?
Thank you for your question, Talisha. And the first part that you started out on is what we definitely need the audience to understand and build upon, because think about this beyond just simply fairness. That is a component, but it's just not the only component. It's a lot about the impact of science on people's health. And if you think about it this way, when it comes to inclusive research or representation in clinical research, the life sciences industry actually needs to know, does this medicine work in all populations that should be studied in, mirroring the actual disease? And so if the disease says, there's a breakdown, this percentage of the population has this disease, Hispanics have this percentage of it, African Americans have this percentage of it, the science needs to reflect that, so that the idea that when this medicine comes to market, that is safe and effective for those specific populations. So it's beyond science. And I do understand that the national conversation on what used to be called DEI, which is many variations of that now, has really, become more challenging. And I understand that. But when it comes to inclusive research and representation in clinical studies, the life sciences industry and the nation as a whole really can't retreat from that, because the science does support. We need to have that knowledge. We need to know when a medicine comes to market, or even in post-marketing studies, does this medicine have a positive impact? How is it safe and effective in the populations that the disease affects? And that needs to be known. And so beyond fairness, that should be a requirement, because it's very important to know that science. I had a situation with a family member, a loved one, who had been admitted to a hospital in what's called a hypertensive crisis. Essentially, blood pressure was too high, and the doctors were working to lower my relative's blood pressure. And there's a class of drugs called ACE inhibitors. It was known long ago that this class of drugs can be effective overall for heart failure, for hypertension. However, studies did show that they may not have been quite as effective for African Americans on blood pressure. And so that led to some clinicians making a decision not to use them in African Americans. The downside to that is that that class of drugs specifically are very effective at preserving kidney function. And chronic kidney disease does have a negative impact, more of a negative impact on African Americans. And so I had to advocate for my loved one and say, well, I respect, your understanding, and the data is factually correct. It's incomplete. And the incomplete part of that is, yes, while these drugs are less effective for blood pressure, they are effective preserving kidney function. And in hypertension, preserving kidney function is very important. And so I was able to get my loved one on an actual ACE inhibitor to help, my loved one not just lower their blood pressure with other drugs, but also preserve their kidney function from that specific hypertensive crisis. And thankfully, they didn't go on dialysis. But I would imagine many people may not know that. They may not be in a position to advocate that way. And that can be very challenging. And so as we move forward, it is good, as we all know in this industry, that the Food and Drug Administration, or as we call them, the FDA, actually has promoted over the last, maybe decade or so, that clinical trials and life sciences industry need to have what's called a diversity action plan. And a lot of progress was made, and this year would have hopefully been the year where you actually saw even more progress on that. While that's been delayed, I can say that regardless of any regulation or not, it's very important to know that in this particular industry, in this particular setting, there needs to be a knowledge of these drugs and medicines work effectively for all populations, because it gives confidence to those populations, but also helps us better understand and know we can have the confidence that these medicines will work safely and effectively for those that are truly impacted by the disease. And minorities, and specifically African Americans, tend to have a less positive effect from cardiometabolic diseases, and it's important to know that. So hopefully that answers your question. Hopefully the audience will understand why it's so critical that this moves beyond fairness to knowing the science of how these drugs work, and that's beyond the negativity and the national discussion around DEI, because the science is really important.
Thank you, George, for sharing that. And as you know, the science behind this is really important. And Alan, this is for you. We do understand that industry, meaning pharmaceutical companies, the FDA, as George mentioned, understand the scientific implications behind this and really want to see more diversity in clinical trials. From your perspective, what does it really take for a trial site to be a genuine partner in community?
Thanks, Alicia. And yeah, the industry is starting to expect more diversity in trials, just as George was discussing. But it's not just enough to say it. Action needs to be taken for there to be any real change. People need to be made aware of what clinical trials are, what the process is like. Engaging with our patients and local community members is essential for building relationships, for us to have a presence in our community, and have the opportunity to connect with people from different backgrounds. That's why we're leading this initiative. We want to have these conversations. That's the first step to making any change happen. And in order for us to be competent at doing that, we need to understand and respect and reflect the communities that we're interacting with and serving. And so understanding why there may be hesitance or mistrust is crucial. We want to know why people would be unsure about participating in a trial. Understanding what they're going through when dealing with managing their medical conditions is important because we can get an idea of their history and their experience with their doctors and why that may have led to them having mistrust or hesitance. So, we want to make sure we're doing everything we can to create trust for patients to get the medical care they need. And so participation might be a good option for certain individuals. For example, some patients have an intolerance to certain medications or they're not effective, just as George was discussing earlier. And so seeking treatment for a new medication is an option if you pursue that through clinical trial participation. In addition to that, there might be treatments that people don't have access to because their insurance policy doesn't cover it. They can't get reimbursement for that. And so sometimes that same medication is being evaluated in a different capacity in a clinical trial, and patients can gain access to that. So, I do want to put it out there that it's not a guarantee that you'd be eligible. Sometimes patients don't qualify for certain studies. Also, there's no guarantee that you'd receive treatment because there's a placebo component to many trials. But regardless of that, being aware of the option of potentially gaining access to treatment and care in a trial is something we really want to highlight.
Thank you, Alan, for that explanation and really showing us that, you guys at Clinical Trial Research really understand how to engage with patients and really building trust in the community. Rhonda, you are in community every day. What are some of the most powerful ways that you've seen trust being built? And how do we make sure our approach is genuine?
Yeah, so I think it's important to be in places and spaces where people are. You've heard the cliche, we need to meet people where they are. That's places, I say places and spaces where people work, eat, shop, pray, play, and slay. And so, not just being there when a research organization wants information or wants to engage and enroll people in clinical trials, but being there on an ongoing basis and having the presence that's consistent and showing that commitment. Alan talked about partnership. Yeah, demonstrating that partnership is a long-term thing and not necessarily a transactional thing where people come and go. I think the other thing that is important is to value people's time. When you are in those places and spaces, talking about participating in clinical trials, enrolling people in clinical trials, making sure that you're spending their time wisely, that you're respecting who they are and the space that they're in, and also compensating people equitably who do participate in clinical trials. I know sometimes there's a disparity there in terms of patients of color versus other patients who may participate in clinical trials. And I think it's also important to really center their voices in often the design of the process and the trial up front, and helping to really make sure that they're culturally tailored for the community and appropriate for the communities that you're trying to engage in research. And so I think that plays a big role in breaking down the barriers to trust, and building partnerships, and also longer term improving outcomes. So yeah, building those partnerships and relationships is important. Again, not just coming and going when you want something, but being there for the long term. Because we know, yes, participating in clinical trials is an important part of closing the gap in disparities. And closing the gap in disparities is a long-term commitment. So again, being present on an ongoing basis and building those relationships and partnerships. And I think the other thing that is important is around the language that's used. I've heard researchers, and I call them armchair researchers, because they're doing the research and leading and guiding the research, but they're not out in communities really interacting with the communities that they're and gathering research and information on. And so when we hear people say or use the words hard to reach or underserved, sometimes that sounds like undeserved, which is not a good connotation. But you know, when people say hard to reach communities or populations, I say, well, I know where to go if I want to work with homeless people. I know where to go if I want to work with the AAPI community or the Black community. So I know exactly where to go. So I'm not quite sure why they're labeled as hard to reach. So I think the language that we use sometimes can influence or create a perception about how certain communities are viewed when we're trying to work and engage them in research, as well as other things that are related to healthcare and the medical industry. And then oftentimes it's important to have someone who looks like the communities that we're trying to serve and engage, you know, out there talking about clinical trials if they are sharing their own personal story because they've participated in clinical trials. That's a great way to build trust. That's a great way to connect with communities. People may often feel more comfortable asking specific questions of someone that they feel more familiar with and can identify with. And so all those things are important when it comes to making sure that we're breaking down those barriers and engaging folks in the right way.
Thank you, Rhonda. Sustained engagement is so important, and I'm so glad that you mentioned that. And I want to follow up with that with Dr. Wayne, because we've heard from our NOWINCLUDED community members that there's a worry that, you know, clinical sites only reach out when there's a need for participants in a study. How can sites make sure patients feel truly cared for and not like they're just being signed up for something?
Yeah, patients definitely notice when things are rushed and impersonal. And healthcare access, it's in general, it's a huge problem. And as patients, we feel like a number, right? It's very hard to get an appointment with a doctor at various specialties. It's hard to get studies done. At CTR, we feel that we are personal. We treat people with respect and care. We get to know our patients. We get to know their needs and try to offer something of value to their health. And we do try to build relationships first so that research participation really feels more like an option, not an obligation. Our goal, again, is to build a relationship with a patient. When there's a research study that could potentially be of benefit to them, we will invite them to consider the study. And we will offer help with transportation. And as Rhonda pointed out, there's reimbursement for time and travel. We offer a free intake visit where I will discuss a person's all of their health conditions and their medications. And yes, our agenda is in large part to ultimately offer a study to them, but also we're paying attention to the whole person, to all their medical conditions. A lot of times I will find medications or medical conditions that are not observed by their primary care physician. At CTR, we will generally include lifestyle support, such as having a dietitian meet with our patients. And in the cardiometabolic space, where we're doing studies on obesity, overweight, diabetes, high cholesterol, hypertension, lifestyle counseling is just as important, if not more important, as medications. Giving good dietary advice and moving, exercise. And in general, when you're part of a study, we're another layer of medical care. For example, I can write prescriptions as needed if a person is having access problems to their health provider. And as I mentioned before, because we're very thorough, we sometimes find health issues that people are not otherwise aware of.
Wow, it sounds like you really do a lot for the patients that you see, and that's really great to hear. And I'm hoping the audience is really listening and understanding what types of services they can receive while participating in studies. Rhonda, you mentioned language earlier, right? And I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because one of the things that we've heard is that people don't really like the word recruitment. And it feels transactional, like, we're taking something community rather than working with or alongside community members. How can changing the language using words like invitation or collaboration actually help in terms of building trust?
Yeah, so using those kinds of words really implies this is more of a partnership and something that we're doing together, versus someone coming in and taking what they need and then leaving when they have what information they came or they were seeking. And so again, co-designing clinical trials or research or even engagement strategies for communities is very important as part of building that relationship and breaking down those barriers. And I guess we can say engagement. I think if you do all those things up front and include people early on and further upstream in the process, then it's easy for people to opt in. Maybe recruitment might not be it, but they can opt in once they really understand what the trial might be all about, how it benefits them and their community, how it can maybe even save lives. And so I think if we're improving the health literacy and understanding around clinical trials, then recruitment may not necessarily have to be the term that's used, but really people choosing to opt in and participate and engage in research more often and on a larger scale, hopefully.
I like that. Opt in. It really, it changes the whole scenario to me. Thank you for sharing that vantage point. So up to this point, we have talked about cardiometabolic disease, how it disproportionately affects our communities. We've talked about the fact that African Americans are missing from the research space and all the challenges that go along with that. And we've also talked about some of the solutions, the most important being building trust within communities and also at clinical research sites, like sites at clinical trial research. And so now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about some treatments, GLP-1 medications specifically, because they're getting a lot of attention right now because they're being hailed as being widely effective in managing type 2 diabetes and for some obesity and weight. But here's the thing. If we're not part of the studies on these medications, we can't be sure that they're actually working for us. And so that's why it's so important that we, participate in research, especially around these medications. And so I would like to ask Dr. Wayne, for these medications, the GLP-1s, which are like Ozempic and Wegovy, I know people are more familiar with those names. They're being hailed as game changers, right, in terms of weight management and diabetes. And why is it so important for Black people to be included in these studies for these treatments?
Yeah, so GLP-1 medications are groundbreaking for treatment of type 2 diabetes and obesity. There is a ton of research going on now investigating potentially new and even better treatments than those that you just listed, Talisha. And as George pointed out, the medications that we have available to us can be more or less effective and have different side effects across different races and ethnicities. So if Black folks are not in research trials, we can't be sure that those medications work the same, or if there are differences in side effects. And specifically looking at the medical condition of overweight and obesity, it's at the core of this cardiometabolic cluster of conditions. And by aggressively treating overweight and obesity, we can improve many of the heart attack or heart risk factors such as prediabetes, diabetes, high blood pressure, and high cholesterol. I think finally, with overweight and obesity, the medical community is recognizing it's a real condition, and it's a chronic condition, and it is, as I mentioned, it is at the base of these cardiometabolic conditions. So by treating overweight and obesity, we can have a huge impact on these conditions, and ultimately in more catastrophic events such as heart attacks and strokes. I think we're at the cusp here with obesity and overweight research. There are a lot of pharmaceutical companies now working on newer and better treatments.
Thank you for that explanation. This is for George. I know we talked a lot about diverse participation in research really affecting science, right? How does having Black people in these studies lead to better research and make sure our data is part of the story?
Yes, Talisha, it's not just about, checking the box and making it transactional. I think Rhonda gave us a great overview of that. It's about, maintaining it over, the life of the medicine, preclinical, post-marketing, making sure that we do understand real world evidence. All of that comes into the fact of making sure that we know this medicine is effective in all populations. And the benefit to that is that it would actually give our community that confidence. Now, not everybody on the call is going to go and read, the drugs prescribing information, but it does help to know and understand if they do reference the information, if they do decide they want to go beyond just what they're being told and look it up. It also matters to that healthcare professional that they know and understand as well when they're prescribing a medicine, whether it's just something over the counter or something that they have to come in and get a prescription for, that the healthcare professional and also the person on the receiving end have that confidence to know that, hey, this medicine is safe and effective for everyone, including me, because it also builds confidence for them to stay on the medicine. We know that the GLP-1s that we just talked about are effective and they're very safe, but staying on them is important. And so to have that staying power, people need to know that. And personally, for myself, my father and the men in my family prior to him really had not lived beyond the age of 70 because most of them passed away to something called sudden cardiac death. It's a heart problem, but it's also something to do with the electrical system that's within the heart. And the challenge with that is that there were medicines that were effective, but those medicines really hadn't been studied as well in African Americans. And so physicians hesitated to use them. Back in 2001, a study came out that showed these medicines are safe and effective in African Americans. That helped my father to get the treatment that he needed because there was an understanding by both the clinical community, which is the prescribers, the doctors, the pharmacists and nurses, and also the receiving community, the African American population, that, hey, we have a safe and effective medicine, for, my dad at that time. And so that confidence spurred me to ask his cardiologist, can you please give him this? And the cardiologist did. And so I can personally say when that confidence is within the healthcare system, both on the healthcare professional side, also on the patient side of the people receiving the medicine, it can be helpful. It's best for the life sciences industry to do that proactively, meaning that it's a part of what is developing in the medicine, the clinical trials up front versus on the back end where it's more reactive of, the Food and Drug Administration observed, hey, there's a lack of data here, you need to address it. It can be redressed. It can come up later, but it is better to do it proactively so that when the medicine comes to market, that confidence is already there and healthcare professionals are not questioning, do I use this or not use it in the African American population? Of course, things can be corrected, things can be amended, but it is best to have that up front so that there's a confidence there. And with my father, yes, it came after the fact because obviously the medicine that we're discussing was being used in the European American population quite extensively. Once that data got in the African American population, his cardiologist put him on it, and we're very grateful. And thankful to say my father did live beyond 70. But I will say that it's best to have that up front. And my hope is that, the life sciences industry, despite the challenges that are faced in the language and the consternation around, what we traditionally call DEI, I hope that the life science industry, I think it will stay committed to inclusive research because patients need it. And that goes beyond politics, it goes beyond opinions to make sure that people have the right treatment that they need.
Thank you so much, George. I wish I was in your family. I want you to come to the doctor with me. You've done an excellent job of really, taking the theory and, bringing it down into practice. And thank you for that. And I hope the audience really understands it more as I do as well, right? And so we've been talking about access to new treatments and the goal being health equity. Not just who gets the medicine, but how the medicine is developed and proven. Alan, can you break down what that means for the community?
Yeah, Talisha. So yes, there is a difference between access, so being able to get the treatment, and equity, being part of the process that shapes and tests that treatment. And with access, someone can't access something they don't even know about. So the first thing we need to do is to create awareness of the opportunities to participate in research. And we do that by hosting events, attending events, marketing ourselves and what we do, engaging with people in any way we can show up and tell people what we do and what options are there for them. So at least they can explore the idea of participating in research, explore potential trials that might be of benefit to them, their friends, their family, etc. And so making our presence known and making people aware that clinical trials can be a resource for them is definitely the first step. Now, that kind of goes hand in hand with equity in that once you put yourself out there, or once you create awareness of these opportunities and of this reality for people, they can then seek the idea of participating. They can then be open to it and explore it. And so, access sometimes isn't possible for everyone based on their circumstances. If, for example, there's financial hardship, or they have other obligations that prevent them, that's going to be an obstacle, and it's going to be one that's difficult to overcome, and we need to address that head on and acknowledge that. And so, like Dr. Wayne mentioned earlier, we provide reimbursement for time and travel. So if people need to take time off work, or the expenses they incur to make it to the office to participate, those are things that we need to address and overcome, because that's going to be able to give patients access to participation, and that's going to improve equity overall. So.
Thank you very much for walking us through that, Alan. That was a very good explanation. Really appreciate that, and really walking us through that entire process, right? From and what your site is doing to actually help people that have the challenges like access, providing transportation, et cetera. Really, I hope people will feel empowered to, explore clinical research participation. Rhonda, from your perspective, why is it so important that diverse voices and experiences are included right from the start, before drugs are even approved?
Okay, so before I answer that question, I wanted to just kind of piggyback on the last portion of the conversation because of how obesity does affect the Black community. I think sometimes we look at obesity as a choice amongst everyone. I mean, Americans are generally overweight, just in general. But when we look at the Black community, we know that there's a higher rate of obesity amongst Black Americans as well as Black Californians. Here in California, 37% of Black Californians are obese or overweight. That's significantly more than every other race and ethnicity here in the state. We know, at least from what used to be on the Office of Minority Health's website, is that 3 out of 4 African American or Black women are obese or overweight. That's 75%. Not sure if that number is completely accurate now, but I would say there's probably more women walking around with extra weight than probably is a healthy state for them. And so I'm only saying that because I think we need to recognize the prevalence of obesity in our community and what that means from a health and wellness and longevity standpoint. And especially now, we know that there's many cuts to Medi-Cal. Here in Medi-Cal is Medi-Cal, that's Medicaid nationally. That all comes from the One Big Not So Beautiful Bill Act. And so with that, access to GLP-1 drugs are going to be very limited, especially for folks on Medi-Cal here or Medicaid across the country. So participating in clinical trials might be one way to get access to those drugs for people who really struggle with obesity. If we, again, look at obesity as more of a disease versus a choice. And so I think being aware of that as an option for that specific condition might be one way, again, that can overcome the issue of accessibility, availability, and affordability of those drugs. So just wanted to kind of uplift that a little bit. But then to answer your question, again, kind of going back to why it's important to have these voices. Again, it's part of building that trust and overcoming the word recruitment and having to work so hard to recruit folks. But if there's more participation and engagement and input up front when it comes to clinical trials, there's more buy-in and support for that. Trust, I think, happens as a natural progression. And also kind of treating the community like they are more the experts as opposed to telling our community how they should go about doing things or why they should be participating all the time. And so, again, that respect and engagement and support and being seen and heard is also important.
Thank you so much for adding that information, especially around obesity and the prevalence in our community. That was really helpful because a lot of people do think of it as a choice, right? And, it does have some medical aspects to it as well. So really, I am just excited for this conversation that we have just had. That was the last question that we had for the panelists. We've talked about, the importance of clinical research, especially as it relates to cardiometabolic health. And really want to hear now from the audience. If you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat and we'll see if we can get them answered for you. Okay, so while we wait for those questions to come up, we had a backup plan. Had some questions that we could ask while we're waiting for some from the audience. And this one will go to Rhonda again. How do you respond when people say they don't trust clinical research at all?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to be a well-informed healthcare consumer. And so getting information, understanding what a particular trial may be all about, I think is important. So I think a lot of times we maybe buy into what we see on the internet or hear on social media, but I think it's important for people to do their own due diligence and research to understand better what that is all about and get information from trusted sources, at least the ones that are still available and accessible now, considering all the changes. So I would say just make sure that you have the right kind of healthcare information and intelligence that you need to really learn for yourself about clinical trials, what it means to participate, what are the guardrails that are in place. I mean, things like what happened with the Tuskegee experiment and the Henrietta Lacks story don't happen anymore. There are more patient protections in place these days and more guardrails to prevent these atrocities that we've seen in the past happen in the current times when we talk about medical and clinical research.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and so we do have actually a question from the audience, which is, what advice do you have for someone who wants to get involved but doesn't know where to start?
Talisha, I can take that question.
Yeah.
So,
Sure, thank you.
yeah, so, the most common first step would be starting with your doctor, discussing with your doctor that you're interested in participating in a trial. And if your doctor does know about local sites or studies, that would be the best way to get started. But if they don't know which direction to point you in, maybe they don't know local sites or new treatments being developed, then I would look to finding a clinical site local to you. Googling them, giving them a call, emailing them. Oftentimes, clinical sites have a website where you can sign up to learn more. Whether that's a private site or a university, get in touch with them, explain your interest. And usually a clinical site can create a health record for you. So, they can have a conversation about your medical history, what treatments you've tried, what you're currently using to manage your medical conditions. And then they can establish you as a patient, sometimes an in-person visit or even just over the phone, establishing that health record. That is going to be a pretty solid way to go. You can also ask the research sites to contact you when there's a study that's suitable for you. And oftentimes they're going to remember, they may not remember you or they may remember you, but ultimately, if you've established yourself and you have a record with them, oftentimes you'll be automatically contacted to be considered for the study. Another resource would be clinicaltrials.gov. So clinicaltrials.gov is going to list every single clinical trial available in the United States. You can search trials local to you by medical condition and obviously zip code. And then another thing I want to highlight is to focus on the relationship that you have with the site, not just maybe a particular study or medication, because oftentimes you might not qualify for a study, but there's always going to be more studies that are open for enrollment, that are looking for patients that are suitable. And so establishing yourself with a site can put you in a good position to gain access to the opportunities to participate in studies that fit you.
Thank you for that. And I can tell you, as someone who used to work in recruitment at a clinical trial site, we would love for you to come and visit because it is challenging and it can be, very hard, to be quite honest. So please, as Alan mentioned, do the research and reach out to some sites in your area. I'm sure they'd love to hear from you. And do we have another question? All right. In the instance of the GLP research, you all talked about we're not getting enough of the data from the Black community. Do you think it's due to the protocol and the eligibility criteria, or is it due to the lack of trust in research?
Yeah.
Maybe George?
Yeah, I can start with that one. I do think the life sciences industry did make concerted efforts to try to have diversity in clinical research, GLP-1 research, and others. It's possible, as Rhonda's mentioned very well, there is a lack of trust, from the African-American community within the industry. But there's another challenge that came to light recently, which is, while I definitely, we feel we have the right people here who are doing the right thing of asking their patients, do you want to be in a clinical trial? That's perfect. However, that may not be consistent with healthcare professionals around the country. And so there has been an observation that if a healthcare professional offers the opportunity for a patient to be in a clinical trial, that patient may be more likely to overcome their mistrust and participate. And so it's not a single out as one issue, but there are multiple issues where the industry may not have been able to successfully get as much as they wanted throughout their efforts, that they would have just not done it. They've tried to get patients in there. But also clinicians offering up the opportunity. While we have some great clinicians here who are doing that, that's not consistent across the nation in California, and we hope that'll get better. So there's multiple issues, including the mistrust. And the only thing I want to say is there's also another tool that you can use. I'm going to put in the chat. It's called Research Link. That's linq.com. That you may be able to go, and it's a more simplified version of clinicaltrials.gov that's much more user-friendly, where you can maybe find the right clinical trial for yourself. I'll put it in the chat.
Thank you so much for that additional resource. I think we have time for maybe one more question. And I see that there are a lot of questions in the chat. And unfortunately, we can't get to them all, but I think that means that we've had a very good discussion here today. And so we'll see if we can have one more to close us out. All right. What steps are taken to ensure research is ethical and culturally sensitive within the communities you serve?
I can take that one. So as I mentioned earlier, there's the California Bill of Rights, which talks about all aspects of the study in general, the pros and cons of the study, the potential side effects, the fact that you can opt out of the study anytime you want, and also there's a detailed informed consent process. So there's an informed consent. It's a document. It's generally about 20 pages long. It's written in a way that we can all understand, and it goes into detail about the study, the procedures, why we're doing it, again, what the potential side effects are, that you can opt for other medical care, and we go through that with the person before they enter into a study and answer all of your questions. So the informed consent process, it's rigorous.
Now we have another question. Well, actually, Dr. Wayne really answered that question already, right? And so at any time during a trial and you want to, if you don't want to continue, you can definitely opt out. But Dr. Wayne, do you want to say more about that? Well,
Yeah, we hope that when a person starts a clinical trial, the intention is that there's a commitment, that barring life situations, that you're gonna continue to the end with the study. But yes, you absolutely can opt out any time for any reason.
All right, well, thank you guys. Again, as I mentioned, this has been a really interesting and informative conversation. And as you see, I've put up the resource that George offered. Thank you very much for that. We know this is not, one webinar is not going to fix things, right? But it's definitely, a step in the right direction. And so we definitely want to continue this conversation through our community hubs and our local partnerships, and really by making research something that feels like it belongs to all of us, because it does, right? We invite you to join us, if you haven't already, to visit the NOWINCLUDED.com or at now_included on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. And if you have a question, I know there were quite a few questions that we didn't get to. You please feel free to email us at hello@nowincluded.com, and we will get those questions answered for you. Also, be sure to also follow our partners on Instagram. For California Black Health Network, it's at CHBN, or excuse me, at your CBHN. And for clinical trials research, at clinical trials research, as you see on the screen. Thank you all very much for your participation. I'm really glad you were here for this, and I hope we all participate. Thank you.